Now let's talk about some of the fundaments of opera conducting. These are going to be a series of things to consider while we're conducting and specifically for the opera world. The first thing we're going to do is talk about hand independence. Of course, we're talking about this all the time. This is part of basic conducting technique. But in opera, you can attribute different functions to different hands, and you can have one hand be primarily focused on the stage, whereas the other hand can be really with the pit at all times. There's also something else to consider concerning your hands and their placement in opera conducting, because contrary to other forms where basically the musicians are laid out in front of you and you're on the same plane, in conducting you have people who are much lower than you in the pit and people who are much higher than you on stage. So I think it's always better to really attribute one hand in general to one plane. So the left hand for the stage and the right hand for the pit. Now you don't have to do this 100% of the time, but I think it's important also for the musicians to know, where am I getting my information? If the musicians in the pit know that they're always going to be having the information they need coming from this hand, and they know where to go to get it when they glance up from their score, it's going to be a lot easier for them. And similarly, you can get people's attention on the stage much more easily with one hand if you always know where that's going to be. So it's just attributing different functions for different planes of your conducting experience. The next fundament we're going to talk about is the center of gravity for conductors. Now this is something that I noticed being a female conductor, and not a lot of people, if anybody, talked about this, but I think it's very important to consider where your center of gravity is. For a lot of male bodies, the center of gravity are the shoulders. For a lot of women, the center of gravity does not focus on the shoulders. We're lower in the hip area. And this makes a difference, because if you're going to go for your center of power, then you'll want to go to your center of gravity. And it might be more comfortable, if your center of gravity is here, to do gestures that are more upwards. Whereas center of gravity being lower, you can get more power naturally, anatomically, from something a little bit lower. And this actually helps us with conducting, because as we're on a platform between two worlds, the orchestral musicians are below us. So we want to have something that is effective, a gesture that's effective and more downwardly positioned for the musicians in the pit. And then we have, of course, this upward gesture for the people on stage. So consider where your center of gravity is, and you can also adapt your gestures and your sources of power from your particular center of gravity. Let's talk now about active versus passive beats. In symphonic conducting, most of the time, unless you have a concerto or something special, you're going to have nothing but active beats, because even the prep beats are active. They're giving information to the orchestra. You have active energy, we're about to come in, etc. And then you're going through the music. They're all active. In opera, you're going to have passive beats, and passive are marking beats, basically. You might show 6 bars where the orchestra doesn't play, but they have to know that 6 bars have passed, especially for people who are counting a lot, right? Some brass or timpani or whatever. So you're going to be using this kind of a gesture to indicate to everybody this is 1 measure, 2 measures, 3 measures, etc., which is different from an active beat, which is either the prep beat, okay, now we're going to come in, or actively making music. So the active versus passive beats is very important to understand. How do you make a passive beat? You basically do not put air or active energy into the baton. You just do an indication without having impetus in the motion, right? So only with the wrist you could do. You could also do with the arm, but again, it's interesting to remember the different points of articulation and how detailed you can get with each one. You don't need to give a lot of information with a passive beat, you just have to mark. So that's why I like to use the wrist as opposed to a larger point of articulation like the elbow or, again, the shoulder. So for passive beats, that's all you need. Don't put breath in the baton. For active beats, you put breath or intention or energy in the baton, and that's the main difference. Let's talk about trigger words now. Trigger words are specific words when the singer is singing that will compel you to do an active prep beat so that the orchestra can come in and play. And this is after a period where you might be static and just marking bars or just waiting for a moment, and we don't know when the trigger word is going to happen, so we're just waiting, we're listening, and then that trigger word comes and it propels our arm into action to prep and then enter the orchestra. For example, if we take Tamino in this famous recitativo scene, everything is just finished with a little march, and then Tamino goes with Die Weisheitslehre dieser Knaben, right? So whether he says long Die Weisheitslehre dieser Knaben or Die Weisheitslehre dieser Knaben, you don't know exactly what his tempo is going to be, but that's okay because you've got your trigger word, and the trigger word in this case is Knaben, right? So we do act like passive, Die Weisheitslehre diese Knaben, Die Weisheitslehre diese Knaben, and Knaben, boom, that's active. Boom, pam, pam, right? So, Die Weisheitslehre dieser Knaben. There you go. So the trigger word gets the hand active and does an active prep beat so that the orchestra is ready. So what you can do in your score study is actually circle the trigger words, and when you're going through, you can practice with your hand marking the beats or marking where you are, saying the words, and then circling the trigger word and saying, okay, where am I going? Now is the trigger word. So again, with Die Weisheitslehre, Die Weisheitslehre diese, and then Knaben would be circled, and then you're off to the races. And you can even do a little arrow if you want when you're studying to show in which direction is my active beat going to go inside, or is it going to do outside, or is it an upbeat? So you could also put a little arrow, if that will help you to know how you're going to respond to that particular trigger word. So remember, nothing appears on a page by chance, and it's up to us to discover its meaning and purpose. We practice this through deliberate, regular, and detailed score study. If we listen closely enough to the score, it will tell us everything we need to know.